Jess Phillips is a British Labour Party politician who's been a Member of Parliament for Birmingham Yardley since 2015. She was an initial candidate for the Labour leadership race in 2020. Prior to this, she worked for Women's Aid Federation of England, responsible for managing refuges for victims of domestic abuse in Sandwell, and has also served on the West Midlands Police and Crime Panel. So for those who don't know, you're an MP representing the Labour Party in the UK Parliament. Briefly, what does this job entail?
Oh my gosh. I wish there was a job description that somebody had told me what it entailed, but being a Member of Parliament it is what you make it, and for some people the answer would be completely different. But for me, it is essentially, you are a national legislator, spend a huge amount of time looking over different bills and legislation and scrutinising whether it's tax changes or new laws around safety or food standards. You spend a huge amount of your time looking at national legislation, so that's 1/3 of my job, I'd say. Yeah. The second third of my job is essentially I'm a support worker and a social worker, so I spend half of my week back in my constituency, and I have an open office where people come to me for support, and that's anything ranging from families turning up with their bags, homeless, nowhere to live, children with no places, school places to go to, and people come to me to advocate, so it's like it's a bit like being a solicitor. Yeah, so I'm an advocate. And then the third part of my job is I'm a political campaigner. Most members of Parliament, there's a huge element of their job that is party political, where you are campaigning for your political party and the ideology of your political party.
So I suppose there's a lot of variety involved in being a politician.
No day is ever the same as the one before. It's massive. But then, having said that, there's a lot of tedium as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
It's not all really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, about what stage did you know you wanted to be a politician, and how did you become a politician? How do you get into it?
I mean, I hate to answer this question because the truth is really makes me feel like really sad. I wanted to be a politician from as long as I can remember.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when I was little, really little, because my mum and dad were really political and real political campaigners. They were. When I was, before I can even remember, I was marching for nuclear disarmament and marching for striking workers when I was like 3 years old. When I was a kid, we used to we were always at something at the weekend. We didn't do other things that other families did. We were always campaigning. And so I always thought, well, I want to be one of the people who makes the decisions from a very, very early age. How did I go about doing it?
Yeah.
I mean, it took quite a long time because I had my children when I was quite young. And so for a while I was just trying to pay the rent, I suppose. And so I was working in the voluntary sector for Women's Aid and for asylum seeker charities. And then in doing that, again, I saw the policies were that were going wrong and things that were being done badly, and I once again started to think, you've got to be one of the people who makes the decisions if you think things are wrong. But it's a hugely long process to become a Member of Parliament. You have to be selected by your political party, you have to campaign, mostly for women. It's very rare that women get given the safe seats. So I stood in a seat in Parliament where there wasn't a Labour MP, and I had to win it from a different political party.
Okay.
So, and that's much more common for women than it is for men. And so that whole process took like 3 or 4 years before I was even guaranteed. I mean, I wasn't guaranteed a job at the end of it. So there's a huge amount of work.
So despite you always being interested in politics and wanting to be a politician, there's a lot in the way before you're able to actually become a politician.
Because for 3 years I had to work. In fact, I had 2 jobs. In that 3 years, my mum died and I was caring for her. I had 2 small children, one who was only 1 at the time, when I first sort of stepped forward. I had bills to pay, and you don't get paid to be a candidate, and I was a candidate for 3 years fighting the election. There's many, and it's not a dead cert. There's many times when you feel like, even though you wanted it since you were a kid, it'd be easier just to not do it.
Very difficult. I mean, at the moment there's lots of mistrust in politicians around the world. how do you think this can be tackled so that the people are once again willing to trust their government?
I mean, for a start off, it's the responsibility of governments to be trustworthy. That would be a step in the right direction. But then there is a sort of symbiosis. There is, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Where it doesn't matter how believable you are, or how truthful, or how good, or how caring.
Yeah.
There will always be a sense in the media, and that definitely leaks into the general public, that we're in it for ourselves, that we can't be trusted, that we don't have the people's best interests at heart.
Yeah.
And that is a lie that is peddled often by people who are from the establishment in order to keep their power.
Yeah.
So if you were to look at in the UK at somebody like Boris Johnson, who went to Eton and then Oxford, and then had a plum job that, the kind of where I grew up, people didn't even know his job existed.
Yeah.
And he would claim that I was the establishment to make people not trust people like me. Yeah. Because it feathers his nest. So the reality is that the way for a start off, politicians all need to behave better and need to tell the truth, need to answer the questions when they're asked them, rather than giving the answer that they want to give. To speak like people and to live amongst people would be a massive, massive boom. But in reality, we're so far down that particular well that alone, without the public wanting to trust politicians or being ready to, it won't make any difference.
So the kind of trust games going on in Parliament. Yeah.
There is a potential, there is a real potential for people to believe that politics is on their side again, yet the people with power need the public to be at a level of fear and or hatred.
Yeah.
Divide and conquer. It's the simplest way to gain power.
Yeah.
It's much harder to spread hope and honesty and trust.
Yeah. And it's kind of on a similar topic. Politics appears to be becoming increasingly polarised. Why do you think that is, and how do you think that can be solved?
I mean, why that is very... because it's a global phenomenon. Yeah, it's not something that exists just even in Europe. It's
in the US we see it.
The US, but also all over the world.
Yeah.
Where there was a move towards progress, and then in some countries, so Canada and New Zealand seem to be keeping up with progress, but where the arc of progress was going quite well, it does seem that there is a stop. And now I genuinely believe that the reason for that, they're usually socio-economic. So the global financial crash, like any crisis, and there's two sorts of crisis that countries or collections of nations can go through. One brings people together and makes people have a sort of sense that we've all got to stand together. So that can be, and I really hope that pandemic is one of those.
Yeah, I was wondering actually.
I really hope that pandemic is one of those. And for want of a better word, war is often used by those who can do it well to make people feel that in the aftermath of war there is a need for togetherness. But the kind of crisis that makes people much poorer. So the global crisis that feels like it is a group of elite people making a group of, or a mass of people worse off. The rhetoric becomes very easy to spread. If you haven't got very much, you want someone to blame, and politicians with bad intentions will help you blame somebody whose fault it isn't when it's actually the fault of politicians. And so the global financial crisis was, I think, the beginning of the division. But the truth is it's cyclical. Progress and decline is cyclical. And for people like me, who grew up throughout the 1980s and 1990s, where it just seemed like women's rights were getting better, gay rights were getting better, race relations were getting better, people were getting richer. It felt in the Western world that things were getting better. And so people like me convinced ourselves that liberal democracy was the default, where even in Europe, liberal democracy has only existed for 80 years. these things have a cycle,
Mhm.
and that you have to think that, because that means it's going to go up again.
Yeah.
That we're going to get the good side again, maybe by the time you're my age.
Yeah. But you think there needs to be some event to cause that like reunification?
Oh
like,
gosh, I'm not suggesting that we have a
No.
war
No,
or
of course
a pandemic, although we've got one.
But I mean, something like this could actually
absolutely. And
have
funnily
positive.
enough, I think that the pandemic, one thing that I think is interesting about the coronavirus issue is that I think that when people realise they are a group mentality starts to set in.
Yeah.
So universal healthcare in America is literally the only way to actually solve the corona crisis. They're going to have to stop charging people because otherwise it won't work. In the UK, there's talk of like universal basic income because people who don't have secure jobs will need, and so it becomes very so. When we realise we are actually a group, we become much more socialist.
So I suppose it can become quite interesting from a politics point of view.
The left shouldn't waste a crisis, but it often does.
Yeah.
The right never wastes a crisis.
And just finally, one quick question. Do you agree that the climate emergency is the biggest threat facing the world or the UK? And therefore, if so, should addressing this be prioritised in policy making?
It absolutely is the biggest issue. It absolutely should be prioritised in policy making. It absolutely won't be by pretty much any country in the world, because the pervading view of most countries, and some are better than others, is that economic value is the thing that we are tested by, growth. And there are ways to make the green agenda cause economic growth. But until we can properly square the circle of how underdeveloped countries can still develop to what we all take for granted.
Yeah, exactly.
We should be really, really careful when we tell countries like Bangladesh
absolutely
about this sort of thing, when we all live with clean sewers and factories that we can all work in.
Yeah.
There's got to be much, much better social policy thinking about how it has to have an up offer, not always just seem like you have to stop doing things. But it absolutely should be, and actually every single government should have the vast majority of their civil service working on what that looks like in that country. They absolutely don't. In any country in the world, that isn't the case, I don't think. Certainly not in America or China, where we might need it to be.
I mean, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but thank you very much. It was a very interesting interview.